Revolution, a word that we're constantly hearing from everywhere, every side and whole. The frequency of it is kind of scary. We romanticize it and desire it, although never without fear. It is reasonable, because the majority of cases, revolution is associated with something negative. This association is a result of propaganda, coming from the current state of power. And of course, there's the other side of the coin, the romanticization of revolution. Romanticization that results from alienation by those who are on the oppressed side. The sad reality is that both of those approaches are generally wrong, and they ignore what revolution really is and what power and importance it has. Today, we're gonna talk about that. What is really revolution and why are we looking at it in the wrong way? Whenever a riot or something similar happens, the media starts frightening the population to possible revolution, giving absurd examples like USSR or China revolution, forgetting on purpose that both of those countries were in a state of civil war, and those examples are more about the consequences of a civil war than anything else. And even in those examples, the media only transmits a one-sided story, blaming the revolution on the revolutionaries. Revolution is not a riot. Revolution is not an insurrection. Revolution is not even a forced change of government. Revolution is a long process of change that happens at a socioeconomic level in a society due to its serious class conflict. It takes so long that the majority of humans who live through it never understand that a revolution happened, and only by looking in a retrospect can someone say that there was a revolution or not. This might sound a little bit confusing, and I'm gonna do my best to explain what I mean. So how does it work? First of all, I wanna make a full disclosure. This topic is extremely complex and will not be able to talk about everything, so take everything I say with a grain of salt. Second, there are many types of revolution, but in this case, I'm just gonna talk about the socioeconomic one. Either you want it or not, but the basis of our life is our socioeconomic means and the means of production. The majority of what we do and how we behave is directly impacted by those things, including our morals. Slavery and public execution were abolished by capitalist revolution, in the same way that the 8-hour labor and women's rights are achieved by ongoing social revolution. And this is the reality. When our economics and the way of production changes, we as a society change with it. In this sense, I partially agree with Engels when he says that the main engine for our society's progress is class conflict. When one of those classes becomes obsolete. To better show what I mean and what I believe, I'll bring different historical examples. We will start with the first revolution, known as the neolithic revolution. Before it, we as a species lived in big single tribal families all over the world, but all lived in very similar socioeconomic status, primitive communism. There was no such thing as private property, everything was communal, belonging to everybody, and no one at the same time. It was just physically impossible to own something. And it made sense, because not only was it impossible to survive on your own, but it was impossible to control means of production on your own due to the vast territories that we occupied. There were more tribes than ever. There were tribes that never encountered other tribes in their lifetime. Due to that, there was no economical conflict, mainly because it was only one class. Everything changed when we were forced to change. During the last ice age, around 12,000 years ago, we were forced to abandon the majority of the place where we used to live and to initiate a mass migration, searching for warm lands full of natural resources. The lack of a paradise resulted in the never-seen-before phenomena, mass concentration of population in certain areas of the globe. The biggest point of concentration of humans became what we now know as the Fertile Crescent. The only problem is that some humans got there before others, and not only they got there, but they changed the way of life for that matter, abandoning their old ways of living and settling down, mainly because we had limited land for an unlimited population in different climates. This in turn resulted in agriculture. So the first revolution had begun, a neolithic revolution, where the two human classes that were in conflict were nomadic humans and then ones that already settled down. This revolution lasted around 7,000 years and resulted in the dominance of the second group and the creation of agriculture and first civilization. The invention of agriculture allowed humans to drastically increase their productivity capacity. Where once we needed everyone to work and produce, we now had a possibility to have 6 people out of 10 working, letting the other 5 doing other stuff, including letting them be full-time warriors, organizers, engineers, etc. Basically, we created the first hierarchies. one of your workers died, you could just replace him, but you could not do the same thing with a good architect or a good warrior, so they got some privilege. So naturally, their intrinsic value rose, putting those humans in the top of hierarchy. All this process lasted around 7,000 years, and when finished, we already had the next revolution in sight. The creation of full-time warrior class allowed humans to enslave other humans. Those same warriors had time and possibility to watch out for the slaves and stop any revolts. And so, once again, we saw the creation of two different groups: society who owned slaves and society that didn't. The main question was to kill or not to kill the war prisoners. Before that point, we always killed the war prisoners because keeping them alive meant more mouth to feed. But now, as we already had much more food and we had new warrior class, it means that we could afford to have slaves and even make a beneficial to us. Having slaves allowed us to have first regular armies and another big diversity of important professions, including philosophy, mathematics, and other many, that resulted in the first multi-city civilization. All of this due to all the free time we got in our hands, advancing the slave-owning civilization above the other, creating in this term a new natural conflict between societies that own slaves and societies that didn't own slaves, being the win in this revolution on the side of the slave owners, as more slaves meant more productivity and more food, which allowed them to increase their army numbers, which once again not only allowed us to rise with our civilization, but also gave us big advancements in the technology and civilizational instruments. It was a big step in human relationships, as now, after the war, the tribe that won did not commit genocide on other tribes, just enslave them. Basically, we were able to produce more food with less manpower, at least our manpower. And as a side note, I want to mention that the majority of scholars nowadays agree that the slavery was the first form of private property, because with the mass influx of slaves, they became so many that could not belong to a city or a community. So for the better organizing, slaves started to being assigned to a particular individual as their own personal responsibility. Slaves became first type of capital, creating an intrinsic value to it, creating an intrinsic value to it. That still persists to this day. The value that the capital must be always increasing its own value, or else it will collapse. If someone is confused, I'd like to remind you that this is the time of ancient Greece, Persian Empire, and later Roman Empire, the last of the big empire, slave-owning empires. And everything was almost perfect, if not for some internal contradiction that eventually led to the destruction of this kind of civilizational structures. Being the first one, the fact that it required constant expansion and acquisition of new slaves and lands. That's why the majority of ancient civilization were empires. When those empires were forced to stop their expansion due to geographical problems or some other powerful empire, they began to have the second biggest contradiction in this system, and one of the most important to its fall, class contradiction that existed between freemen and slave owners that kept increasing the capital. In a slave-dominated society, the labor of a freeman becomes useless, as you have slaves that can do anything or for almost no cost, while at the same time, those society had an increase in the general freeman population, resulting in enormous cities with no jobs, where the population needed to be fed by the government in order to survive. Basically, the majority of the population didn't have possibility to work. It was a direct class conflict. The slave owner class and the free man that didn't own slaves. The patrician versus the plebs. This in turn resulted in mass exodus from the cities. Free men started living on small portion of land in small communities in order to be able to feed themselves. A legendary city like Rome, in 500 years, went from a population of 1 million to only 10,000 inhabitants. Those ex-plebs needed to find a way to improve the amount of food produced from the smallest portion of land, as they didn't own much, and so they evolved and created new tools in order to better explore the land and feed themselves. This is why we see a gigantic increase in medieval agriculture compared to the Roman one. Why improve your tools and techniques when you can just buy more 100 slaves? So because of that, the progression was always in the hands of slave owners who didn't want it or didn't need it. This conflict, in conjunction with other factors, led to the destruction of those kind of socioeconomic structures. Once again, a class conflict resulted in a revolution, a feudal revolution, a revolution that lasted almost 700 years and was the most peaceful in terms of direct conflict. Despite there not being an open class war, still millions of people died. By the end of feudal revolution, once again two new classes emerged: feudals and the peasantry. Being the social contract, the peasantry would produce food and work for the feudals, while the same feudals protect them from external threats. It was extremely beneficial for both parties until around 14th century, when the feudals become obsolete because the economy and the army, and also more the taxes, all relied on the last class, the peasants. Slowly but steady, the feudals become parasites. just like the last elites before them. All the innovation and advancement came from the oppressed class, the peasantry. This conflict resulted in a new revolution, capitalist revolution. And I just want to give a quick reminder that peasantry class considered not only peasants, doctors, lawyers, bankers, engineers, etc., were all considered part of the oppressed, of the peasantry. The first glimpse of capital revolution was in the 14th century Italian city-state, places where it was safe to commerce and to do different kind of activities due to its walls. In these small cities, commerce, banking, crafting, and similar activities were thriving, and so the feudals become obsolete in this kind of scenario. The cities were completely auto-governed and heavily relied on mercenaries, armed force to defend themselves against the threat. As it usually happens in the first attempts of a new revolution, the old regime fights back in the form of a counter-revolution. Big old feudals of Europe had too much power and no desire to see the power change in its structure. And so, prosperity of the small Italian cities didn't last long. But still, the revolution had begun and nothing could stop it now, not even the current power structure. The first big major win for the capitalist revolution happened within the Dutch province of the Holy Roman Empire, where the Dutch fought a civil war for more than 80 years and won their independence. With their independence, they also implemented a new socioeconomic structure, capitalism. The Dutch were the first to implement capitalist republic, the first to finish this new revolution, followed by England, USA, and many more. They implemented a structure that was so more advanced than feudalism that it made the Dutch the worldwide superpower for a few hundreds of years. After the Dutch, many other revolutions followed in different forms, but still, feudalism was slowly dying, capitalism was prevailing everywhere, being its early adopters the biggest beneficiary from it. Capitalist revolution lasted around 400 years. One of the most important capitalist revolutions, in my opinion, is the French one, because the French Revolution showed the world that not all peasants are made the same. Due to France's massive colonies, there was a very big influx of money into France. Many individuals became mega rich, but despite their massive wealth, they were still considered peasantry due to their bloodline and due to the fact that near the French Revolution it was almost impossible to buy titles. So it's important to notice that when we're saying the French Revolution was made by the peasant, it's important to remember that in those peasants there were included many who owned the means of production. During the same French Revolution, a new problem arose. Problem that not all revolutionaries were the same, and that not all of them wanted the same goals. They realized that there is a conflict between them, a class conflict, which later resulted in so-called terror of the French Revolution. The capitalist revolution is the only one that we have that is extremely documented compared to the others. We don't know exactly what happened in the turning points of the others, but in regards to this one, we know that at the time of one of the last points in this revolution, which was the French Revolution, things like class conscience started to form. Only 30 years after the French Revolution, we already had a riot between those who owned the means of production and those who worked there, workers and capitalists, the new two struggling classes. The power now relied on owning capital and the means of production, with the main purpose being constantly to increase their own profit and value of it. This new capitalistic system was a big step in human progression. It was better than feudalism in a lot of ways, from technological to humanitarian. But one of its biggest changes was the way that we made people work. In feudalism, we created a fake defense dependency, where the peasant was forced to work in exchange for personal defense against the world and other agents of aggression and attack. In a capitalistic society, we change to economic dependency, where the worker is forced to work in order to guarantee a basic income to survive, which in turn resulted in a wage slavery, as now we had a working population concentrated in the cities with very limited space, where the workers needed to subjugate themselves to wage slavery, or else expect starvation. They didn't have the small land that their ancestors had to sustain themselves. If we forget the workers' exploitation and their horrible condition, capitalism was achieving great things, especially in the beginning, where the capitalists were constantly trying to improve their own production and to make it cheaper for the general population, leading to an explosion in technological advance. Although this came to an end, and some of the capitalists became too big and created monopolies of certain products that led them to stop working towards improvement. We saw a change from the majority of the profits being used to invest back into the business, the majority of capital going to personal fortune and big accumulation of wealth for a few capitalists. Money that was used mainly to create propaganda and influence politics. It even came to a point where capitalists, instead of improving their own products, financed new wars in order to get access to new markets, which in turn resulted in many wars, including the World War I, which, if oversimplified, is basically the capitalist nation fighting for global market domination. Another big factor that shows us that capitalists were slowly turning into parasite was the fact that already by the end of the 19th century, capitalists stopped being necessary to organize production, as they did the century before. Now the workers were charged with doing everything, including their organization of work. Now capitalists could just own a lot of assets and receive money from it and not doing anything, or almost anything. All those reasons and many others led to a assertion of a new class, the workers, the proletarian, which were created due to capitalism because they created production where thousands of people worked together, where they could develop a sense of commune, class conscious and interclass solidarity. A class that was in direct conflict with the interest of the new ruling class, the capitalist conflict that resulted in many revolts all across the world. Conflict that showed us that we are already entering into a new revolution, the workers' revolution, a revolution that we are living right now. And if we were to apply the same standards we used before, we could say that the new revolution started in 1871 with the creation of Paris Commune, a commune that was quickly dismantled, although its legacy remained and persists through the Russian Revolution, later the Chinese Revolution, and now the Socialist Revolution that came after. Like many revolutions before it, this one is constantly optimizing itself, with every new attempt being better than the last. Like many before it, it will take time, probably less than the capitalistic one, and will only be over when the majority of the population will pass through this new socioeconomic status. And if you believe in the power of history, this is unavoidable. If you don't believe in the power of history, just look at all the contradictions the capitalist world has. They are growing day by day and will lead to nothing except its own collapse. Once again, thank you for watching. Do your own research, because I'm just an amateur doing videos on topics that I like. And if you really like my videos, consider liking, subscribing, and if you really like my videos, consider becoming a Patreon to help me make this video faster. And thank you for watching this. Bye.